Hi, folks. Thanks for joining me for the Crossing the Divide webinar on January 17th. We went over time, but there were a couple of questions I just couldn't get to in the time that we had together, so I wanted to answer them for you. I think that there were four, so let me just share my screen and I'll walk you through just a couple of quick answers to those questions. So first, the first question I got asked that I didn't get to is there a standard way of asking participants if they felt deeply heard? And this was in relation to my comments about what a community member shared about rather than active listening, can we create the space for deep listening? Or can we, instead of, having a checklist of people feeling like they were heard, we can create the space where they feel worthy or valued or even loved. And it's not about getting their way or agreeing with you. It's about the experience of the conversation. So here's a couple of responses to that question. So first, I think we should ask ourselves, what are we trying to measure by asking that question? How would we know that people are deeply heard? Are we trying to measure a shift in trust? Like, do they trust us more now than they did before? Are we trying to measure whether the relationship is strengthened or even whether they feel respected? So I think we got to get clear on that first. But we could ask questions like, and when I say ask questions, I'm thinking like in a survey or in a comment form or on a big dotmocracy board, where they put dots and they rate their answers to these questions. Think about interactive tools, think about using Menti if you're doing it online. So we could ask questions like, did you have opportunity to share what was most important to you? So that speaks both to the space and that the questions were invited, the input was invited, and that they chose to participate. We could ask, did you have the opportunity to learn what was most important to others? Because that also speaks to the space of respect, of deep listening, of deeper understanding, so that they're sharing in the space. We could ask, did you feel like your views and experiences matter and were understood? So matter tells us whether they feel like their contributions were valued, whether their contributions will be considered or used or were important, and were understood means that there was a conversation, there was a reciprocal interaction. We could ask, did you feel like the process itself was respectful, welcoming, and like your input matters? So I've covered that input matters part, but respectful, oftentimes when people walk away from a conversation, they will say that they didn't feel respected. And that is like a catch-all bucket for all sorts of things. Listened to, heard, cared for, valued, like they matter, like the process was meaningful. All sorts of things go into that catch-all bucket. But, having them rate that, or how respectful and welcoming did they think the process was? So those are a couple of questions you could ask. I want to offer a thing that's really important in this space. If you're actually trying to get a sense of, are you building relationship? Are you building trust? Are you creating a shift in the polarization in the space between you and the community or stakeholders you're serving, is to consider pre and post surveys or polls or tools to measure a shift. How much do they trust the organization? What has their previous experience been like? How much do they know and understand about the topic right now? How much do they know and understand about what their neighbors or other community members think and feel? And ask those questions at the beginning using a quick poll or a survey or some dots, however you want to do it. Be creative in the interactivity, and then ask those same questions now that they've been through a conversation. Where do they stand now? And see if there's a shift. That shift tells you where you're making progress. So a couple of things to think about. Thanks for asking that awesome question. Here's another one. How do you set the boundary between being and doing in order to help a process move forward? And are there tools that help? So in the webinar, I talked about a competency, being skill, knowledge, or a way of being. And I talked about the doing skills. We've probably invested a lot of time and energy in building things like facilitation skills and communication skills, and our ability to assess conflict, our ability to even invite or recruit others to a conversation, our ability to design and implement the right methods or tools. Those are doing skills, actions that we take, right? Often grounded in the knowledge that we have. But being competencies are things like courage, humility, integrity, authenticity. They are the competencies in how you show up that has an impact on other people and on the space of the conversation. And those competencies, those being competencies, require a particular mindset, but they also require growth and self-awareness, emotional intelligence, lots of learning about yourself and also about the space of the conversation. So here's my answer. First, I think you should understand your own preferences and tendencies. If we created a rating scale, because everyone kind of falls into a tendency towards doing or a tendency towards being. And I talked about how if you have too much doing, you can get a ton of stuff done, but your relationships can become transactional and you can actually erode trust. If you've got too much being, you could have strengthened relationships and probably improve trust, but you might not get a lot done. So you need to dance with the two. Now, we've all got a particular tendency or preference, right? Some folks go right to action, making to-do lists, getting stuff done, moving things ahead. You know who you are. You've got the spreadsheets and the project charters, and you love to write a good engagement plan. That's those folks. The folks who are in being are really concerned about the space of the conversation, are they welcoming and inviting? They're focused on the building relationship piece. Both those things are important, but you need to know where your preference is, because that will also tell you where you need to stretch. If you're going to dance in both those things, in this particular moment, is doing required? Like we need to just move forward. Or is being required? We need to pause and stay with the emotion and the relationship. And there's no clear indication sometimes. Sometimes you just got to go with your gut. I'll tell you, honestly, my preference is doing. I like to get stuff done. It's that I have learned over decades of doing this work that I get stuff done better, more successfully. I perform better when I get stuff done in a generous, loving, and kind way. When I get stuff done grounded in empathy and compassion, I get stuff done with the courage to ask the hard question. So I layer the two for myself. But I know that if I get really stressed, I tip into the doing, and I need to watch for that. So you need to ask yourself that question. Then I think in a situation, you can ask yourself, what will this situation require of you, and what will these people need from you? That's a bit of a guideline to decide how you dance with more doing or you dance with more being. So context matters, right? You need to understand the situation, the background, the history, the perspectives, the lived experience of the people that you're engaging with. Meet them where they're at and gently invite them to a place of discomfort. We talked about discomfort in the Crossing the Divide webinar. Not so much discomfort that they can't participate and they resist, but just enough discomfort that it stretches their way of thinking. It expands their horizon away from the status quo and what they're familiar with, and also what they're kind of stuck on as well, into a space of possibility where we can explore something new. So discomfort is a tool that allows us to get there, but we got to hold the tension, and it can't be so much tension that we feel overwhelmed. Think about the distinction between safe and brave spaces. Now, there's a whole chapter in my book, and this theme comes up again and again in it. Safe spaces. So first of all, I personally believe there are spaces for some people that will never be safe. And so, affected by trauma, affected by lived experience, affected by who's leading the session, power and imbalance and roles that are in the conversation. I instead would like us to invite brave spaces where we can each be courageous enough to say what we really need to say, and that the space itself can be brave enough to accept it and to welcome it. There's a real distinction between those things. And sometimes we conflate safe with harmony and sameness, and we all think the same. And then when someone says something divergent, or someone raises an issue that's kind of stomping around the room, but everyone's ignoring, we often then make them wrong, because they have affected this safe space. So just watch your inclination or your own reaction to what happens in a space, and whether you yourself are defining safe as same, because they're different. And then set goals for the conversation that relate to both action, getting stuff done, and also feeling and experience in the space. So if you're trying to figure out where do you dance, what are some tools? Well, think about your process and set some goals. What are the things you want to get done? What are the tangible products of the conversation? And then what do you want people to feel and experience? And set some goals for that as well. That'll help you dance with the two things. And then prepare yourself as well. We did an exercise in the January 17th Crossing the Divide webinar. Prepare yourself and set a stake. Answer those 3 questions. How do I want to show up? What am I committed to? And what impact do I want to have? And that will help you stay grounded in the space. And that includes being and also doing. Okay, here's the 3rd question I got asked that I didn't have time to answer. How do we have constructive conversations across values, knowing that values are key to our identities and that they don't change? That is a big question. So I'm just going to give you a kind of quick answer, because that is years of study and work, but a fabulous, fabulous question. And thank you for the really digging into this topic. So let me say this. First, let's think about values. So what are values, right? Values are not the things people say or their positions or their opinions. Values are not what matters to people. Values are why those things matter to people. Now, we all have a variety of values that we hold. They come from our lived experience. They come from our family and our community and our culture, and our way of looking at the world, our worldview. But they can change in importance and priority depending on the issue, the situation, the stage of life. Depending on when you're in your early 20s and you're building a career and you don't have children or family, for example. And then in your early 30s, if you do have children and family, your priorities will change. And that means that you're rising one value to a higher status and you're lowering another value. And that can change over the course of your life. It can change because of the situation and the lived experience you can have. It can change internally and it can change externally. Now, let's talk about identity. So identity is made up of a wide variety of things, and values are just one of those things. So the other things, that could go into making up value is culture, lived experience, worldview, geography, like the place that you come from. What else? Oh, I don't know. I'm drawing a blank right now. 2 minutes ago, I could have told you 12 things, but that's a few things anyways to get you started. So identity is made up of a wide variety of things, and values are just one of those things. Our identities evolve and they change based on internal factors, so self-awareness, personal growth, changing, situations or life experience. And they change based on external factors. So changes are in our environment, in our work environment, in our family situation, in our geography. Now, we can have conflict when our identities are called into question or challenged, or when external factors threaten our identities. So this question that's been asked is actually far more complex than how do we have these conversations when our values are key to our identities? Because actually our values can change or reprioritize, and our identities are constantly growing. They're not stuck and static. They're constantly evolve. And I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, I was hired with two other colleagues and myself to run a program, a leadership program for the Yukon government. So that's in the north of Canada, for their leaders, managers, supervisors, directors of Indigenous descent. And the leadership program was called Indigeneity and Leadership. And so that's identity, right? But identity is not homogenous. Not every leader in the program of Indigenous descent had the same identity or the same values. And so let's pull that apart and recognize, right, the core to that is helping people get super clear on what their values are, and then therefore what their identity is, who they are at their core, and what they want to stand in as a leader. And so we need to pull those things apart if we're going to have conversations where values and identity are called into question, or even where there's conflict. So here's some ideas. How do we have constructive conversations across values and identities? For starters, build capacity. Build skills, knowledge, and ways of being to talk about really complex, difficult things. I gave you some examples of those in the Crossing the Divide webinar. Deepen understanding of participants themselves, of their own values and identity, so they can speak it and share it, and of other participants, right? So that they're sharing in the space, and deepening understanding that we're, of course, not all the same, whether we grew up on the same street, in the same culture, if we hold the same value, we're not the same. And that diversity is deeply important for us to explore and deepen understanding. Change the experience so that the experience itself creates a different kind of space that allows a different kind of sharing. So by that, I mean, choose different methods, choose different techniques that are surprising, are inviting, are not what people would expect, and invite and call them in to some kind of different conversation. Build relationships, demonstrate trust. So don't just ask people to trust you, but actually demonstrate that you can be trusted, and break down what that looks like. What are the markers of increasing trust in this conversation, and ask people to define that. Invite complexity. We talked about that in the webinar, and grow your own competency to lead these conversations. So those are just a couple of tips. That's a big, juicy question. And so I hope I've helped just a little bit on how we do those things. And here's the fourth question I didn't get to in the webinar. Can you talk a little bit about political leaders and how we support and encourage brave conversations with our community that are not divided along political lines? Whew. So if there was a big, juicy, hairy question, that to end it all, that is it. So obviously I can't solve all the problems in the world in a 10-minute video. So let me tell you just a couple of things that are really important to think about. The leader of the conversation has power and influence, whether it's you as a practitioner, whether it's a political leader, whether it's a leader of the organization, or it's a community leader. It always impacts the conversation. Who participates, who chooses not to participate, the perceptions and biases and views they have of the conversation. We need to make that visible, what the power and influence is, and the impact. So that's saying, here's my role. Here's who's paying me. Here's why I'm here. Here's what I'm committed to. Here's how you can hold me to account. And that includes whether you're an engagement practitioner or you're a political leader. That needs to be at the forefront of these challenging conversations. Who leads impacts who participates. And so let's talk about those impacts. If it's going to be a political leader, it's going to be a senior leader in an organization, a private sector, an NGO, or a government, we need to talk about then who will come and who will not come. And what are the impacts of that? And how are we standing in an equity-centered foundation for meaningful engagement if, for example, some people will not participate if certain people lead? And so have we thought about other ways to make sure we're amplifying and hearing those voices? Can we create opportunities for collaboration and cooperation on key issues across political lines or across just the sides of an issue? Can we get people to come to the table to say, actually, you're totally against this and you're totally for this, but you all are fighting for your community? So can we start there? Can we start there, working together to plan a different kind of conversation? You're all in service to your community, whether it's political leaders or whether it's community leaders who might be opposed. Let's start with an invitation to cooperation. Can we put the conversations in the hands of the community itself and instead invite political leaders to listen, instead of political leaders always leading, and the impacts of those conversations, both positive and negative? Can we ask community to lead and invite political leaders or organizational leaders to come and listen? And let's be really, really visible about that with name tags that say, hi, I'm Bob, representative of this government or this organization. I'm here to listen. The big tag, with the hi, my name is tag on their shirt, because then we demonstrate that we're actually listening. And of course, those folks who are wearing those stickers will need maybe a little bit of coaching and support to understand what the impact of actually listening looks like. Can we leverage crisis as an opportunity to try something different? So sometimes political leaders, senior leaders in organizations are stuck, and what they've been doing over and over and over again isn't working, and they know it. And so it's time to try something new. I've worked with a lot of organizations in the last couple of years who recognize trust couldn't get any worse, that their organization's credibility couldn't get any worse, that the perception of their organization as not caring and not in service to the community could not get any worse. So what's to lose to try something different? And the thing that's really astonishing is when we try something different, oftentimes motivated by a crisis because we're getting nowhere and we're really stuck. We come at it in innovative, creative, maybe even more open-hearted ways. And of course, that has an impact on the process. And then lastly, can we seek opportunities for yes and? And so by that, I mean, this side matters and so does this side. These needs and hopes and concerns and these needs and hopes and concerns matter. And can we invite a conversation that draws us away from the sides into the middle by saying, you matter and you matter. Let's talk about both those things together. So that's just a couple of tips. Wow, big, juicy, hairy questions. Thank you for sharing them. Thanks for being at the webinar or watching the recording, whatever worked. Thanks for offering these really beautiful questions. Such courage to ask them. And I'm so glad to have been with you. Thanks for listening.